Okay, well, my name is Pauline Brown and I'm an MA student with the OU. I just want to give a little bit of background to how I got here studying this. I'm from Brixton in London originally. My parents were from the Windrush generation, and I'm the first generation of Windrush parentage. I came to Scotland 27 years ago and have spent over 25 years working in social justice as a equality and diversity consultant. I also worked as a race equality officer with Glasgow City Council with their education department. So as a social justice officer and equality consultant, I've worked with everybody from the Scottish government, all the local authorities in Scotland, the NHS, the police, and financial institutions such as JP Morgan and the Royal Bank of Scotland. So it was my work as a social justice officer that developed an interest in challenging racism that led me to look at how we got to this place in our history, and developed an interest in the history of the slave trade in Glasgow, particularly. I was asked to run the Black History Tour, which I ran from 2003 to 2007. Glasgow historians began looking seriously into the subject of the history of the enslaved African in about 2006, and also looking and acknowledging their links with the slave trade. Out of this interest, I decided to do a history degree with the OU, and here I am now doing my master's. So my dissertation is entitled Black People and the African Diaspora as a Subject and a Concept in a Sampling of Glasgow, 1833 to 1870. I'll just move this on to look at why I've chosen that time period. It represents the emancipation of the enslaved African in the British colonies in 1833. And it also covers the end of the slave trade in the Americas in 1865. So that's really why I've chosen that time period, to have a look at how Black people were represented in the Glasgow press. It also represents Britain's imperial expansion into Canada, Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand, and how the Indigenous communities were viewed during this time frame. Why this research will be useful? Well, this has been a very interesting year, and in fact, I started the master's in May, early May, and then on the 25th of May, George Floyd was killed in America, and the Black Lives Matters exploded onto our television screens and into our awareness. Black Lives Matters has raised a heightened awareness of the part that our history has played and continues to play in social justice. My research will help to explain how we got to where we are in the 21st century. That is probably my keenest interest in terms of looking at the history of slavery and the history of enslaved people, the legacy and the legacy that this has left. So I'm looking at how we got here in the 21st century by exploring the fairly recent past, 19th century, to understand what the west of Scotland was exposed to in that period. I want to see how this may have shaped its attitudes to Black people, despite there being very few Black people in Scotland or Glasgow. I want to outline the context and then look at the ways in which historians have presented the past. Scotland's hidden history. The Glasgow Herald in April 1832 notes Scotland's hidden history and connections with the slave trade by saying the loss of the North American colonies inflicted the greatest distress on Glasgow, which was not relieved till an intercourse was opened up with the West Indian colonies. It went on to add that the West Indian trade contributed to raise this city to such a state in the scale of the empire. Scotland considered itself during the 19th century the second city of the empire. Like many of the European nations that profited from slavery, Britain began to distance itself from its difficult past, but Scotland went one step further and began to deny any involvement in the slave trade or slavery itself. This was until the last 15 or so years. Glasgow's attitude from the late 19th century up to early 21st century was that it wasn't us. And one of the early historians writing about the slave trade in Glasgow, that was the title of his book. The denial was concrete and complete. Because very few slave ships sailed from Scottish docks, Scotland has been able to hide its extensive links with the slave trade, despite the fact that the 19th century press is so full of articles that show that link and connection, such as the news from all of the British colonies. When I started my studies, I was anxious that there may not be enough material, but the difficulty I have is the overwhelming amount of material and how I make use appropriately of that. So the Jamaica House of Assembly was reported on in a similar way to the House of Commons or the House of Lords. A mail from the British colonies was often more reliable than from the mainland. Scotland's trade with the British and Caribbean colonies included tobacco, sugar, cotton and linen, indigo, and saltfish, dried salted fish of the poorest quality that would have been thrown away before its use as cheap protein for the enslaved was recognized. In fact, Jamaican and saltfish and ackee is still now our national dish, a legacy from the slave trade. Glasgow's street names also reflects its links with the colonies. India Street, Jamaica Street, Virginia Street, as well as the streets that were named after prominent tobacco merchants, Ingram Street, Oswald Street, Buchanan Street, Glassford Street. Glasgow still has the old tobacco merchant's house in Miller Street, a building erected in the 18th century, and its gallery of modern art is the former country mansion of the slave owner William Cunningham. How historians reported Glasgow's history of abolition. Glasgow has a long and well-documented history of abolitionism. This is very much celebrated, and key abolitionists are some of the names on the slide that you have: Dr. Reverend Ralph Wardley, Zachary Macaulay. Much has been written about these abolitionists by scholars, and they have become, if you like, the Scottish equivalent of William Wilberforce. The 16-year-old Zachary Macaulay had been in Jamaica in early 1785. Initially shocked by the brutality of the system, he likened it to being in hell itself, but he became inured to it, and writing in a letter to his fiancée that he had become callous and indifferent. as this was necessary to manage his role as an overseer. However, it must have had a key impact on him as he became a very important figure in the emancipation movement and is one of what's known as the Clapham sect, Scots who moved to South London and helped direct the abolition movement nationwide. Many well-known abolitionists such as George Thompson and James Ramsay visited Scotland and Glasgow frequently, as did Frederick Douglass, a well-known American abolitionist who lived in Edinburgh for a period of time during the 1860s. He spent a lot of his time challenging the slavery in America and fighting for emancipation of the American slaves. If he'd gone back to America, he may well have been re-enslaved. Scotland was more enthusiastic for emancipation, particularly in the 18th century, and they sent more petitions to Parliament pro rata for the abolition of slavery than England, Ireland, or Wales. So Scotland played a key part in securing emancipation of the enslaved in 1833. However, many Scottish people are represented in the British legacies of slave owners, having received compensation for the loss of their property on emancipation. And again, the street names and university buildings reflect some of these people. Scottish MPs such as James Ewan and Sir John Maxwell. The Maxwells, the name of the Maxwells is reflected all over the south side of Glasgow. And in fact, that was the family, the Maxwells, that gifted the city Pollock Park, which houses the Borough Collection, very famous country park in the heart of the city. The Maxwells received over £12,000 compensation, which would be the equivalent of 1,305,000 today. So the 19th century press is full of the stories of the considerable sums that Britain spent policing the abolition of the slave trade. Once they abolished Atlantic slavery in 1807, Britain took on a key role in patrolling the West Africa coast with a base at Sierra Leone, which they policed the coast, trying to stop the slave trade from the other countries that was continuing to practice it. And there is a lot in the press on this, as it almost sought to congratulate themselves on that important and significant role. So a lot of money was spent trying to control the slave trade and to stop countries like Cuba and Brazil practicing the continued enslavement. These nations did not abolish slavery until much later in the 19th century. As I said, these activities are presented in a self-congratulatory way in the 19th century. And Britain highlights this role rather than the fact that up until the abolition of slavery, it had been the biggest nation of enslaved people. There's little acknowledgement of the role that Black people would have played in their own emancipation through resistance, through insurrection, even absconding. And historians in Scotland have documented a piece on slaves who absconded and removed themselves from their owners in the 18th century, the youngest of which was a 9-year-old boy. That reflected the century's trend for young Black males as status symbol. And John Glassford, who I mentioned earlier, there is a portrait of the Glassford family in one of Glasgow's museums that has a picture of a little Black boy standing behind the family. And also in the People's Palace, a museum in Glasgow, there is a silver chain and collar engraved that would have been used on one of the little black boys that were around the city in the 18th century. So I wanted to focus this piece on Glasgow's history of anti-abolition. The history of abolition is very extensive and well known, but there is a history of anti-abolition that is not so readily well known, and Glasgow prides itself on its abolitionist history. Scholars such as Tom Devine has suggested that whilst anti-abolitionism was for the most part concentrated on the slaving ports of Bristol, Liverpool and London, in Scotland, petitions to delay or abandon abolition were generated across several regions, most predictably Glasgow. Glasgow's West Indian Association was the key player in the anti-abolitionist activities. Many of the members of this association will be the people who have streets named after them or are venerated with statues or university buildings. Yet the attitudes reflected in 19th century press and the contribution they have made to attitudes that prevail today are frequently overlooked. One of the historians writing about the history of Black people in Britain has said it would be hard to understand the negativity of the 19th century attitude to Black skin. The West Indian Association in Glasgow had James McQueen as its key mouthpiece. He was the editor of a newspaper called the Glasgow Courier. He was the editor and owner, part proprietor, so a key player. He was vociferous in his arguments to keep slavery and vociferous in his pro-slavery attitudes. He kept up a spirited defense of the rights of the West Indian planters to their property and the denial of the rights of African people. He's considered quite famous in the city for his work, and he was considered very aggressive towards the abolitionists. The themes that he presented anti-abolition were that the slave trade was encouraged by Parliamentary Act, therefore people had a right to it. The rights of the enslavers who had invested capital in the colonies following these acts and the loss of their property was paramount. The financial loss to the nation and the impact on the British economy, and the fact that the enslaved needed guidance and support as they were ill-prepared to fend for themselves. James McQueen wrote a scurrilous review of Mary Prince's The History of Mary Prince, a West Indian Slave. This was published in 1831, and he said that sympathy should be with Mary Prince's owner, who had been defamed by her portrayal of plantation life, and that she should be grateful that she had been brought to England. Mr. Pringle, the publisher of Mary Prince's autobiography, took Blackwood's magazine. They were the magazine that had printed the article. He took them to court and won £5 for libel, and this article was published in the Glasgow Herald. That £5 would be worth £522 in today's money. As you can see on the slide, James McQueen writing on a tour from the West Indies in support of the planters, has written, the mother country has been ungenerous to planters. They have chosen the moment of severest distress to cram their crude laws down your throat. The British government will lose, but you cannot lose face. You must plead your case with your king. And in fact, the planters did go to the king to plead their case to keep slavery. So James McQueen was played, let me just move this on. He was paid handsomely by the West Indian Association. He spent a lot of time denying that he was being paid by them, but eventually it emerged that he was paid very well by them. He tried to portray his views as just coming from himself. But he also believed that Black people were less than human. And as a young man, he'd worked as an overseer on a plantation in Grenada. That experience had left him with robust pro-slavery views, and he never lost the belief that Black people were inferior to whites. Newspaper articles reveal a tour of the West Indies that McQueen undertook during 1832 to 1833, and he never failed to highlight the plight of the poor planters. And the quote that's on screen is from the Grenada Free Press that was printed in the Glasgow Herald, where he was being feted around the British Caribbean as representing the planters and trying to be a vociferous voice for them. So what began as a trickle of articles in 1830 and 1831 became an avalanche during 1832, right up to abolition and beyond. The Glasgow Herald was considered less vociferous in its condemnation of abolition than papers like the Glasgow Courier would have been. Nevertheless, it also contributed to anti-abolitionist rhetoric, and the Glasgow Herald felt that planters were being treated very badly by the anti-colonial British government. One example that was in the papers of this bad treatment was the suicide of a West Indian merchant. Duncan Brown, Esquire, who had constantly been anxious and ruminating about the West Indian questions and the state of his affairs. It will be utter ruin, and the government has treated us badly. He felt that the government were robbing him and other large proprietors. In light of government decisions, his agent in Glasgow had made a demand he was unable to meet. This further upset and depressed him, and he destroyed himself in a state of temporary derangement. This article would have been presented in the papers as the fault of the government and the abolitionists for driving West Indians to such a place. The largest numbers of Scottish West Indians would have been absent landlords, what was known as sojourners. They managed and owned planters, but they would have lived predominantly in the UK, like Duncan Brown. So the anti-abolitionist movement was as strong and as not quite as powerful as the abolitionist movement, but it was there, and it's a part that Glasgow seems keen to forget. Despite their keen involvement in the abolitionist movement, there were many individuals keen to see the status quo continue. During the build-up to the Slavery Abolition Bill 1833, the anti-abolitionists became more frantic in their approach moving usually from one article per newspaper to one on each page. The pro-slavers were predominantly interested parties such as the Glasgow West Indian Association, but also more moderate men who recognised the value of the slave trade to Glasgow's economic status, were participating in this pro-slavery campaign. Their arguments again were rooted in the economic need for cheap labour. Many historians argue that the slave trade was racialized to justify its existence. The trade came first, then the hierarchy of race and the attitudes came to justify. Many believed the enslaved African to be inferior and needing European guidance to become civilized. And this is one of the key things that I found in the 19th century press, the level of belief that Black people are inferior and need European involvement to civilize them. So this idea that Black lives don't matter or Black people are not as important as whites. I've seen 3 different newspaper articles that have the memorable quote, "Two blacks don't make a white." So this is an idea that has been well documented amongst the press. And also the ways that Indigenous communities are discussed in the 19th century press. These ideas that people of colour are not as valuable has been ingrained in our society for over 400 years. My hope is that my research will help us better understand how we got to this place and how these ideas continue to be perpetuated and continue to blight lives. Thank you.